The internet runs on code.
But code isn't enough.
Behind every deploy is a race against complexity.
Cloud scale, cost spike. AI rewrites the rules.
Tools break, titles change.
This is the world of DevOps, cloud, and software at scale.
Built on sleepless nights.
On-call alerts, silent fixes.
We don't just build features. We build the backbone of the modern world.
This is Run It Bare Podcast. Subscribe. Ship smarter, sleep better.
You're listening to Run It Bare Developer Podcast, where we strip tech down to its core. Each episode blends insights from our expert engineers, the developer community, and the support of AI.
Hey, you coding cowboys and digital wranglers.
Yeah.
Remember back in the day when Docker was like the only 10-gallon hat in the container saloon?
Oh, yeah, it was the name.
Right. Fast forward to right now, 2025, and it feels like a whole stampede of new container sheriffs has rolled into town. So what's the lowdown? Has the old Marshal Docker finally hung up his spurs?
That's a good way to put it. And you're spot on. For a good long stretch there, Docker was the undisputed sheriff. It brought law and order to that wild west of infrastructure.
Totally.
It gave us that sweet, sweet taste of portability, repeatability, all that stuff that made deploying apps feel less like a gamble and more like a sure thing. It really did reshape how we sling code.
Amen to that, partner. It was like the Swiss Army knife for us devs for ages. But lately, I'm hearing more whispers around the campfire, Folks trading in parts of that knife, or maybe even the whole darn thing for some newfangled gadgets.
Yeah.
So we're diving deep today into why so many developers are itching to look beyond Docker. And that includes you, listening out there, the ones in the thick of it, wrestling with YAML, chasing down bugs. You need tools that are faster than a greased pig, right? More secure than Fort Knox, and slide into your workflow smoother than a six-shooter in a well-oiled holster. That's what we're wrangling today.
Couldn't have said it better. We've been digging through the digital dirt, sort of sifting through the current trends and chatter to bring you the core reasons behind this shift and to shine a spotlight on the new gunslingers in this whole container runtime showdown.
Right.
So our mission today, pretty clear, give you the straight facts on why this change is happening, what these alternatives are packing, and importantly, what it all boils down to for your daily coding rodeo. No snake oil, no hype.
Just the good stuff.
Just the essential insights you need to stay ahead of the posse.
All right, let's crack this open. Docker was top dog, king of the hill for so long. It gave us this amazing way to box up our apps, make them play nice everywhere. It was a real game changer.
Absolutely fundamental.
But now the winds of change are blowing. More and more companies, more developers are moseying on over to these lighter, more modular, and dare I say, more Kubernetes-friendly solutions.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The K8s factor.
So the big question, is Docker heading for boot hill? Is it dying?
Well, I wouldn't write its epitaph just yet. Docker definitely still has a strong foothold, especially for spinning up local dev environments.
Okay.
But you're right. Its reign is being challenged. In some key territories, speed, security, flexibility, and even cold hard cache.
The money.
Exactly. These are the spurs in this side that are making developers look for new steeds, so to speak. So I guess the first big insight here is that cost is now a major factor pushing teams to look elsewhere.
Cache money talks, doesn't it? And one of the first tumbleweeds to roll through town was that Docker desktop licensing kerfuffle.
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly, if your outfit, your company, was over a certain size, that free lunch was over. How did that shake things up?
That was definitely a fork in the road. Slapping a price tag on Docker desktop for larger orgs. Well, didn't exactly sit well with everyone.
I bet.
I mean, solo coders, smaller teams, they could still use it gratis, which is good. But bigger companies suddenly had this new line item, this bill, for a tool they'd frankly leaned on for free for years.
Right. It felt like a bait and switch to some, maybe.
Maybe a little. And as we've seen, for some, the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze anymore, especially with all these new options popping up like prairie dogs. It forced a lot of teams to take a hard look at their Docker dependency and ask, okay, what else is rustling in the underbrush?
And speaking of things that weren't exactly smooth,
right.
Anyone who's wrangled Docker desktop on a Mac or a Windows box knows the feeling. It could feel like you're running a whole darn virtual ranch just to get a few containers kicking.
You are not wrong. Remember those builds slower than molasses in January?
Ugh, don't remind me. And the way it would just hog your CPU, like a hungry hog at a trough.
Totally. And the battery drain. Forget about working unplugged for long.
Exactly.
While Docker runs slick as a whistle on Linux, because, it is Linux tech fundamentally, the experience on macOS and Windows often felt like you were fighting uphill, both ways.
Yeah.
Relying on those virtual machines, that emulation layer to mimic Linux containers led to those exact headaches. Sluggish performance, hogging resources, developers just left twiddling their thumbs waiting for builds.
So frustrating.
Now compare that to some of the newer solutions like Llama, which is the engine under the hood of Finch, that AWS tool.
Ah, okay.
Llama offers a much leaner, meaner virtualization approach.
Sure.
It's tailor-made for developer container workflows specifically on macOS. The result is like a noticeable pep in performance without the same crazy resource guzzling.
Music to the ears of Mac devs, I'm sure.
For sure. If you've wrestled with Docker Desktop on your Mac, this stuff might sound pretty good.
Right. So performance and the old wallet were definitely pinch points. But then there's the whole security shebang, specifically the talk around the root daemon. Can you break that down? Why has that been such a prickly pear?
Absolutely. Docker's traditional setup, the classic setup, puts a central manager in charge, the daemon. And this manager runs with the keys to the kingdom, basically. Root privileges.
The big boss.
The big boss, exactly. This daemon calls all the shots for the containers, starting, stopping, managing networks, volumes, all of it. And because it has such high-level access, it naturally becomes a bigger target for bad actors, especially in production environments.
Makes sense. Bigger target, bigger boom if it goes wrong.
Precisely. If some varmint manages to exploit a weakness in that daemon, the fallout could be, well, bigger than a Texas Twister, to use your analogy.
Right.
Now, to be fair, Docker has brought in features like user namespaces and rootless mode to try and wrangle these risks. They're not ignoring it, but outfits with a real hawk eye on security often prefer alternatives like Podman, which were built from the ground up without that central root running boss. Podman can run entirely as a regular user.
Daemonless.
Daemonless is the key word. It's like, why put all your eggs in one basket, especially if that basket has a giant danger root access sign bolted to it?
Good point. Now, beyond these specific aches and pains, cost, performance, security, it feels like the whole cloud-native frontier has evolved, right?
Yeah.
Maybe in a way that doesn't perfectly jibe with Docker's original blueprint anymore. You mentioned this idea of like an all-in-one setup versus a more mix-and-match approach.
Exactly. When Docker first rode into town, it offered a very complete package. You got the runtime, you got orchestration with Swarm, you got the image hub with Docker Hub. It was a one-stop shop.
Which was great then.
It was mighty appealing at first, absolutely. Yeah. But the cloud-native landscape has matured. It's become more like a specialized toolshed now. Kubernetes has totally taken over as the head honcho for orchestration.
No question there.
Helm is the go-to for packaging things up, like applications and their dependencies. And then you have these dedicated container runtimes, like Containered, that focus solely on the container's lifecycle, just running the container.
Doing one job really well.
Exactly. So in this new world, Docker's more, shall you say, opinionated tooling. It's all-in-one approach. Well, for some, it can feel less flexible than picking the absolute best tool for each specific job.
It's like having one of those old multi-tools, it's got a bunch of okay-ish gadgets on it.
Right.
Versus building your own custom toolkit with top-of-the-line specialized instruments for every single task. You get more precision, maybe better performance for each task.
But there are also more pieces to keep track of, potentially more complexity in managing the whole toolkit. It's a trade-off.
True. And then there's that nagging worry, that developer spidey sense about getting hitched too tightly to one particular brand's wagon, right? The fear of lock-in.
You nailed it. Developers and the companies they work for are getting more and more cautious about getting too cozy with proprietary tools, even popular ones.
Even Docker.
Even Docker. I mean, while the container image format and the runtime spec are governed by the Open Container Initiative, the OCI, which is great, that's the standard blueprint.
Right. Ensures compatibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Docker file format itself, the recipe for building images, that isn't actually governed by a fully open vendor-neutral standard in the same way.
Huh. I didn't realize that. Interesting.
Yeah, so there's a general preference, especially in the cloud-native space, for truly open standards that offer more wiggle room, play well with others, and stand the test of time. It just reduces the risk of being tied to a single company's roadmap or, importantly, their price list.
Okay. So we've seen why some folks are getting itchy feet. Lots of reasons stacking up. Now let's talk about the new deputies in town. Who are these alternative container runtimes starting to hog the limelight? Let's kick things off with Podman. I hear that name a lot, especially, like you said, from the security-conscious crowd.
Podman, yeah. Straight out of Red Hat originally. It's definitely become a front runner, particularly with those who put security and baby compliance front and center. Its main draw, as we touched on, is that daemonless setup.
Right. No big root boss.
No big root boss. Unlike Docker, Podman doesn't rely on that central privileged manager. Instead, each container, or rather each user running containers, more or less starts its own processes using a traditional fork-ipsec model.
Okay, so more isolated.
Exactly. This inherently beefs up security and makes sandboxing containers much easier. And its native support for rootless containers, letting regular users run containers without any special privileges, is a huge plus.
That sounds like a major win for shared environments or CI/CD.
Absolutely. Plus, and this is key for adoption, its command line interface, the CLI, is so darn similar to Docker's, like Podman run instead of Docker run.
Oh, nice. So the learning curve isn't steep.
Pretty gentle, yeah. Teams can often switch to Podman without having to relearn a whole new lingo or drastically change their scripts. So it's kind of like getting the familiar Docker experience, but with a built-in security upgrade under the hood.
Sounds like a sweet deal. Okay, now what about containered? That name keeps popping up whenever Kubernetes is mentioned. Like peanut butter and jelly, you said.
Right as rain. Containered actually used to be a key cog inside the Docker engine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it was later spun off as its own standalone project and donated to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, home of Kubernetes and many other projects.
Ah, the CNCF connection.
Exactly. And since Kubernetes version 1.24 officially said so long to direct Docker integration, they deprecated the Docker shim.
Right, I remember that whole saga.
Containered has become the default container runtime for most Kubernetes distributions out there. It's built to be rock solid in production, lightweight, super adaptable, and it focuses specifically on managing the container's lifecycle.
So pulling images, starting them up, stopping them.
The whole shebang. It's really the unsung hero, the engine, powering a lot of the managed Kubernetes services we all use. Think AWS, EKS, Google Cloud GKE, Azure AKS. They all run on containered underneath.
So if you're knee-deep in Kubernetes, chances are containered is already part of your posse, whether you actively chose it or not.
Very likely, yeah. It's just humming away back there.
Okay, so Podman, for security and general use, containered as the workhorse for Kubernetes. Now, CRIO, that sounds even more tightly coupled to Kubernetes. That CRI part stands for Container Runtime Interface, right?
You got it. The CRI is essentially that standard set of rules, that API, that allows Kubernetes itself, the kubelet part, to talk to different container runtimes in a standardized way, like a universal translator.
Gotcha.
So CRIO is another CNCF project, but this one was designed from day one specifically for Kubernetes. It sticks strictly to implementing just the CRI, nothing more, nothing less.
Laser focus.
Laser focus. This ensures a super streamlined, very targeted runtime environment just for Kubernetes needs. Now, the flip side is, because it's so focused, it generally won't run containers outside of a Kubernetes cluster. This is not really meant for general local development like Docker or Podman.
Ah, okay. So, specialized tool.
Very specialized. But that laser focus shrinks the potential attack surface, which makes it a favorite for teams with really strict security and compliance mandates. It's the default runtime for Red Hat OpenShift, for instance. Appeals to those who like things lean, mean, and K8's native.
All right, got the lowdown on the big three: Podman, containered, CRIO. But what about those macOS performance saviors we mentioned earlier, Lima and Finch? Because let's be real, battling Docker desktop performance on a Mac sometimes felt like wrestling a grizzly bear.
Couldn't agree more. Those performance headaches with Docker desktop on macOS created a real hankering for better options. Lima steps in here. It's a project that creates lightweight Linux virtual machines on macOS, but they're specifically tuned for building and running containers efficiently.
Okay, so optimize VMs.
Optimized VMs, yeah. And then Finch, which is backed by AWS, takes it up a notch. It's built on top of Lima, so it uses those optimized VMs. And it uses another tool called nerdktl under the hood, which cleverly provides Docker-compatible commands.
Oh, so you still get the familiar commands.
Mostly, yeah.
Right.
The big win here with Finch is that it offers way better performance compared to Docker Desktop on macOS, often significantly better. And crucially, it doesn't come with those same potential licensing strings attached for larger companies.
Free beer and faster builds.
Pretty much. It aims to offer a more native and speedier experience for Mac-wielding developers without the Docker desktop baggage.
Sounds like a real oasis for Mac users in that container desert. Okay, lastly, before we move on, are there any other notable sidekicks or maybe specialized tools in this evolving story that deserve a quick tip of the hat?
Absolutely. Couple quick mentions. NerdTrack Deal itself is worth highlighting again. Think of it as Docker commands that ride directly on top of containered. So it gives developers that familiar syntax, but using the more modern, efficient containered runtime underneath. Useful if you like containered, but miss the Docker CLI feel.
Okay.
Then there's Builda, another interesting critter, mainly from the Red Hat ecosystem like Podman. It focuses solely on crafting OCI-compliant container images without needing a running daemon at all.
Ah, daemonless builds, too.
Yep. This makes it perfect for CI/CD pipelines, where you want a cleaner, potentially more secure build process without firing up a whole Docker daemon just to build an image.
Makes sense for automation.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And last but definitely not least, maybe a bit more specialized, is Firecracker. It's from AWS. It's a fascinating micro VM technology, super lightweight virtualization. It actually powers services like AWS, Lambda, and Fargate.
Oh, wow. Okay. So serious scale? Serious scale, yeah. It's all about being incredibly lightweight and offering strong security isolation, making it ideal for multi-tenant situations or serverless workloads where you need to spin up and tear down isolated environments really, really fast.
Cool tech. Okay, so that's a lot of players on the field now. What does all this hullabaloo actually mean for us developers and our DevOps buddies day to day? Is Docker suddenly yesterday's news? Should we all be, like, stampeding to rewrite our container setups immediately?
Hold your horses.
Yeah.
Not at all. Docker still holds a lot of weight, especially, like I said, when you're just working on things locally on your own machine.
Okay.
Its ecosystem is massive, right? The tooling is mature, Docker Hub is still huge, and there's just a mountain of documentation and community knowledge out there. And Docker Compose, still incredibly useful for defining and running local multi-container setups. Lots of teams rely heavily on that.
Yeah, Compose is pretty slick for local dev. It really is. However, when you start moving towards production, especially if you're using Kubernetes, well, the landscape is definitely shifting. Containered and CRIO are often the preferred or even required partners in that realm.
Right, because they're K8's native or focused.
Exactly. And for outfits that prioritize security above all else, maybe in regulated industries or just because they're careful, rootless Podman is a mighty appealing option. And as we talked about, Mac users now have some really promising trails to explore for better performance with things like Finch.
So the trend is more modularity, picking the right tool for the job.
That's the big trend, I think. Moving towards modularity, picking the best tool for the specific task building, running locally, running in K8s, securing the pipeline instead of maybe relying on one single Swiss Army knife for absolutely everything.
Okay, so the million-dollar follow-up question. In 2025, should you, the developer listening, still be hitching your wagon to Docker? When does it still make total sense, and when should you maybe start seriously eyeing up these other options?
Yeah, that's the practical question. And it really boils down to your specific needs, your team's workflow, and your current setup. Docker is still a perfectly solid bet if you're mainly after a quick and easy, familiar interface for building and testing things locally on your machine, if your team is heavily invested in Docker Compose and those traditional Docker workflows, and they're working well for you, or if you're just running fairly straightforward, non-orchestrated applications locally, keep calm and Docker on, maybe.
Okay, fair enough. But when should the alarm bells start ringing? When should you consider alternatives?
Well, you should seriously consider looking at alternatives if you're deploying into Kubernetes clusters. Containered or CRIO will likely integrate better and might even be mandated by your platform.
Makes sense.
If locking down security is your absolute top priority, especially in multi-tenant environments or places with strict regulations, Podman's rootless and daemonless approach is a very strong contender. You should definitely evaluate it.
Security first.
Security first. And obviously, if you're a Mac developer constantly fighting Docker desktop performance issues, or if your organization wants to steer clear of Docker's licensing for larger teams, then checking out Finch or other Lima-based solutions is absolutely worth your time. Or maybe Podman Desktop.
Right, the cost and performance angles again.
Exactly. And it's not always an either or a choice, right? A lot of teams are actually adopting a hybrid strategy now.
Oh, how does that work?
They might still use Docker Desktop for its convenience during local development on individual machines, but then switch to something like Containered or Podman in their shared CI/CD pipelines and definitely in their production environment. Best of both worlds, perhaps.
Interesting. So it's not about Docker just riding off into the sunset entirely. It's more like it's finding its specific place in a much bigger, more specialized container frontier now.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. It blazed the trail, no doubt about it. Docker fundamentally changed the game. But now there are a whole lot more prospectors in the hills, finding different kinds of gold. The container world isn't really seeing the demise of Docker, but rather the maturation and diversification of the whole ecosystem that Docker helped birth. And honestly, having more choices, more specialized tools is ultimately a massive win for developers.
Yeah, more tools in the toolbox.
Gives us more tailor-made solutions for different needs. And I think the tools that'll really thrive going forward are likely to be the ones that are modular, open by design, built on open standards, and secure right out of the box, secure by default.
So Docker was crucial in getting us here, paved the way.
Absolutely crucial. Couldn't have gotten here without it.
But the future of containerization is being forged by a much wider range of innovators now.
Precisely. It's a bigger party now.
So listener, where do you stand in all this?
Have you already swapped out Docker for certain workloads? Maybe in CI or prod? Are you experimenting with Podman, containered, Finch, something else entirely? What's been your experience out on this ever-evolving container range? We'd genuinely love to know. Yeah, definitely. And I think the key takeaway here, the bottom line, is just that the container landscape is dynamic. It's always changing. Staying informed about the tools that are out there, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, what each one brings to the table, that's crucial for building efficient, secure, and scalable applications in 2025 and beyond.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep adapting. And on that note, here's something to ponder, my friends, a little food for thought to chew on. As these container runtimes do become more specialized, focusing on specific niches like Kubernetes or security or local dev, how is that specialization going to ripple through the rest of the world of developer tooling, CI/CD platforms, the broader cloud-native universe? What new layers of abstraction might pop up as we keep trying to containerize, well, basically everything?
Oh, that's a good one. The next layer of the onion.
Exactly. Something to mull over.
Thanks for tuning in to Run It Bear. Like, subscribe, and share. For more interesting deep dives, join our blog. Link is in description. Catch you next time.